no country would find 173 billion barrels of oil in the ground and just leave them there.
So this next story is a great example of why having Trump in the White House is detrimental to discussing progressive policy. So Trudeau, Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, he is looked at as a progressive icon right now, at least in the way that the larger media is covering him. And yes, he's strong on social issues, he's welcoming to immigrants, and he even has gender parity in his cabinet. But when it comes to climate change, he just doesn't go far enough. So this is a clip of Trudeau talking at a global energy conference, which is described as an influential gathering of international oil and gas executives and decision makers. And he's going to talk about the need to still have oil pipelines. So take a look.
A little over 4 years later, with a number of strong Trudeau Liberals elected across Alberta, we're on our way to getting 3 new pipeline projects underway, which will help connect Canada's oil patch with energy markets around the world. I make no bones about it. We're very proud of this. It's progress. It's important. As I said on the very first trip to the oil patch back in 2012, no country would find 173 billion barrels of oil in the ground and just leave them there.
Well, if you cared about the environment, then yeah, you would leave the oil there. And The Guardian actually covered this and discussed why it's harmful that Canada is digging up this oil. If Canada digs up that oil and sells it to people to burn, it will produce, according to math whizzes at Oil Change International, 30% of the carbon necessary to take us past the 1.5 Celsius target that Canada helped set in Paris. So by digging up this oil, Canada is actually undermining the goal they set in the Paris Accord. Now in this next clip, Trudeau is going to try and balance the conversation a bit.
There will come a day, far off, but inevitable at some point, when traditional energy sources will no longer be needed. In preparing for that day, we have 2 critical responsibilities. One is to sustain the planet between now and then so we can pass it on to our children better than we found it. And the second is to get ahead of the curve on innovation. And we in Canada are doing just that. Canadian companies are leaders in developing technologies such as carbon capture and storage, next-generation biofuels, advanced batteries for electric cars, and cleaner oil sands extraction processes, among other advances.
So, as you can see, it appears on the surface that Trudeau and the Canadian government are really taking a level-headed approach to how they're approaching big oil and investing in new energy. But at the same time, he's undermining his own message. If you want to shift away from dependence on oil, then why are you building new oil pipelines? So his approach only appears level-headed because we're so used to the fact that big oil controls everything. And that's what makes the fact that Trump's in the White House so much tougher on this conversation. Because how are we supposed to have a level-headed conversation about how we need to move away from our dependence on oil when you have Donald Trump in the White House, which arguably, at least for a while, was the biggest influence on other nations in the world? When Trump won't even get on board with the Paris Accord, who many feel don't go far enough, then how are we supposed to have a conversation about how Trudeau is not progressive enough on renewable energy and oil? It really puts people like me in a tough place, because here we are, we want to discuss what we should be doing. But what we should be doing is so far away from what is actually occurring right now that the conversation almost seems ridiculous. And it's just frustrating that we have to keep fighting with these dying industries where the only loss really would be jobs. And those jobs could be moved to newer industries, to renewable energy. There are ways that we can move off our dependency on oil. But if we're not having that conversation and we're still trying to play this game where we're appealing to both sides, it's not going to actually move us in the direction that we need to go. And it's worth mentioning that Trudeau has initiated a carbon tax, which sounds fantastic. It's good. It goes in the right direction. It's what we should be doing. But he's still building pipelines. And we're already way past the idea that climate change is not going to affect us. And it's not like I'm some outlier in this conversation. This is how most Canadians feel. Here's a recent poll that was done in Canada. 77% support or somewhat support a national plan that ensures Canada achieves its international climate change targets to reduce carbon emissions. 66% support or somewhat support the federal government taking action on its own to meet national climate change targets if the provinces and territories aren't doing enough. 77% of respondents agree or somewhat agree that their province has an important responsibility to reduce carbon emissions by 2030. And a majority of Canadians, 59%, support or somewhat support a price on carbon emissions. And 62% support or somewhat support a minimum carbon price that applies across Canada. And look, that's what Trudeau's done. So he's implemented a carbon tax. But the thing is, that still doesn't go far enough. And we're still having this conversation about oil pipelines. And this is why someone like Trump is so detrimental, because it changes the conversation. Despite what polling shows and how people want progressive policy on the climate, we're stuck having conversations about keeping the status quo alive. So while this was supposed to be a discussion on Trudeau and his lack of progressive leadership on the climate, it instead turns into a discussion about how we can't even have this discussion because Trump.